Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible
Bistro.
That's right, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian
faith. You know I don't
faith.
like it when you sing the title.
I know. Well, that's why I didn't sing. I gave you a moment, and you gave me this little pregnant pause, and then now we're here.
I appreciate that. So yeah, it's good to be back. We had a little bit of a break, and now we're coming back off that break.
Well,
so.
yeah. If you last week we replayed one of our famous season 1 episodes, John 14. Where as a technical person, I can hear we've grown a little bit since those early days of production. But it was a great episode, and we've had a lot to download. So if you missed that, go back and look at that. But today is another special day in the Bistro, Brian. Yeah. Tell us why.
Well, we have Chad Ragsdale with us again. He's returning. Dr. Chad Ragsdale's returning to the Bistro with us again to discuss something else. In fact, another book that he's written. He writes books faster than we make podcast episodes or something. But anyway, Chad, we knew Chad at Lincoln. He's a longtime good friend and also now vice president of academic dean. We're trying to figure this all out. He's got titles.
We practiced this
stuff
beforehand.
Yeah, as you can tell. Yes. And so he's academic dean at Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri, in central Missouri, and he was just saying, and we'll talk a little bit about this probably when we get into the book, he's shifting into being a professor more of philosophy and apologetics is the title that you gave it. And you talked a bit about apologetics the last time we had you on, and I think that's a good topic to discuss. But we're discussing this book, and I'm gonna give you the title. You called it Holy Grit, and it's really kind of an examination of the book of Hebrews. Tell me about that title. Where did that? I mean, it's very evocative. Don't get me wrong. And you use it throughout the book. I really like it. But where did that title come from, and how did you?
Yeah, Hebrews, broadly speaking, is if there were a pastoral concern for Hebrews, it would be a concern for perseverance. That followers of Jesus would persevere in their faith, particularly during times of difficulty or challenge. And so the pastoral theme for the book is perseverance. I also had the chance to read Angela Duckworth's book called, it's a very famous book on just with the title Grit. Yeah. And all throughout that book, she just argues that grit is just sort of this secret ingredient to success, that the difference between those people who succeed and those people who don't is oftentimes just about their tenacity and their grit. And so this is my attempt of basically approaching the issue of grit from a spiritual perspective. So what does holy grit look like in the life of the disciple? And
so there's no play on words there at all. It's just okay.
It is evocative though. It catches the attention, which is what you want in a title, I suppose.
Yeah, we didn't discuss. Ryan, have you read Grit? Did you read that book?
I have not read that. No.
It was good. I read it in a leadership course, and it's been several years ago now. But when you first mentioned it, I thought, oh yeah, I've read that, and it took me back to some of the things that she talked about, and it's an interesting read. It's worth reading. Again, not a Christian book, not from a theological viewpoint, but has a lot to offer there, I think, in that. So why did you want to write this book then? You've mentioned a little bit, and you talked about in the intro a little bit, but what led you to write this book, would you say?
Well, I mean, practically speaking, one of the reasons I wrote this book is I've been teaching the book of Hebrews for, about every semester since 2005. I've been teaching the book of Hebrews. Wow. It's one of the quirky things about our curriculum at Ozark that Hebrews is one of those core Bible classes that our students take. And so I've taught that class probably more than I've taught any other class at Ozark.
And that goes back to the Gareth Reese days.
Well, he was at Central up in Moberly. Actually, the reason why Hebrews has been required is kind of a twofold reason. One is a pastoral reason. We offer it right in that sophomore year of the student's experience, and so some of the issues that are being talked about in Hebrews really do resonate well with the sophomore level experience, where students are just trying to decide, do I have what it takes to actually finish my degree? Do I have what it takes to go into ministry and to persevere in ministry? Sophomore year, we've discovered, is actually, it's probably the most challenging year in a student's academic career, because that's the moment where they're really starting to get serious about making a place their academic home. They're getting serious about pursuing a particular career path. Retention levels in that sophomore year are oftentimes a struggle, because students will just kind of drop out of college at that point. So we've required Hebrews as a way of just sort of spurring on perseverance for our students. But there's also a theological reason. We believe that Hebrews is a great bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so it brings together so many of the themes that are important all throughout New Testament theology, themes like atonement theory, the covenant, things like that. So it brings together
Christology.
But my teaching emphasis, as you mentioned, has been changing. It's been shifting. So my credentialing now is more in the area of philosophy and apologetics, and I'm handing over Hebrews to some other professors to teach. And so this is sort of my love letter to Hebrews. Just it's what, a lot of this is kind of the byproduct of just years of teaching the class and that I've learned and stuff like that. So that's one reason. But there's another kind of more immediate or pressing reason why I wrote the book, and that's because I mean, the need for perseverance or holy grit has always been pressing on the life of a disciple. Like, that's why the book was written, because the need for perseverance has always been real for the life of the disciple. But I think even more so today, right? Like one of the things I talk about with my students is, and this observation isn't unique to me certainly, but if we went back in time 500 years, it would have been very hard for you to, as an individual, to maintain unbelief in your life.
Right.
It would have been virtually impossible, actually, to live as a consistent unbeliever.
Right.
Flash forward to today, it's the opposite experience, where I have students who are very committed to Jesus. They're very committed to his kingdom. They're very committed to serving him in his kingdom. But maintaining faith, just at times for them, it just seems so daunting and, so impossible, even in the face of so many of in the face of the headwinds of our culture, right? So, I started to notice just the number of people in my life, the number of students, both former and present students, who are just really struggling to maintain their faith, and at times losing their faith altogether. And I'm like, there needs to be a contemporary message from the book of Hebrews that encourages the disciple to persevere in their faith. And so this is my attempt to help in that regard.
Yeah. It makes a ton of sense when you talk about teaching it, and you said it flowed out of that basically regular reading of it and of the book and teaching the book. One of the words I was thinking when I was reading through it was wisdom. There's a deep wisdom in a lot of this, and in the biblical sense, the application of this, and it makes a ton of sense that you say that. So that's fantastic. It's really good. So how did you envision? So you said part of this, basically you're envisioning people who need kind of that holy grit in their life, taking hold of this book. Were there other, did you envision people reading this kind of on their own?
So I wrote it intentionally to kind of, so it's, obviously you could read it individually, and I imagine that's how a lot of people will engage with it. But I also wrote it as a chapter by chapter kind of study through the book of Hebrews, that if a small group were wanting to go through the book of Hebrews together, this book will facilitate that pretty nicely. There's discussion questions at the end of each chapter. And so I kind of wrote it with both groups kind of in mind. I've heard from a lot of pastors that have already been asking me about the book. They're writing sermon series and stuff on Hebrews.
Oh, nice.
Using this as a resource, perhaps. But
That's great.
So yeah, I would say the person that I wrote this book for, though, was I really wrote this book for my students, and also because my kids are fastly reaching the age of my students. I also wrote it for my kids too, like because whether they're struggling in their faith presently or not, there will come a point in their life where they will struggle with faith. I mean, I think that's I would almost say that that's universally true for a follower of Jesus in this world. I don't know of really any disciple that doesn't walk with a limp. That we will, if we're not currently in a period of difficulty or trial, we're about ready to enter into one. And so this was my attempt of giving them that encouragement, perhaps before they even enter into that season of trial and testing, to be prepared for it. I also wrote this book for the many people in my life that have friends, that have loved ones that are in the process of maybe walking away from their faith. We use the word deconstruction a lot, deconstructing their faith. Yeah. But I wrote the book as an encouragement also for those people that, hey, maybe there are some ways that you can pastorally engage with and intervene with the people in your life who are struggling with their faith. Maybe there's some encouragement that you can offer to them from the book of Hebrews. So yeah, that was kind of the reader that I had in mind.
Since you brought that up, I mean, you started in your introduction, you told three kind of personal stories that, and I think, did you say they happened in the same week, or I mean, in a very short period of time? And, all of them had to do with people that were walking away from the faith at various stages. One you mentioned a very advanced, someone who'd been a believer for a long period of time and, had devoted a long part of their life to Christianity, walking away from the faith. And then you also have and you mentioned it several times along the way. You throughout I would say that's an undercurrent of the entire book. Really, you talk about this idea of deconstruction. You have one chapter that's titled that. Really, was it chapter 6?
Yeah,
I think something like that, or yeah. And so what give us a little bit about how you think Hebrews addresses that. I mean, you've given us some of that already. And then the other kind of question, and maybe you want to deal more with this even. The other question I have is Ryan and I talk about this all the time, is why do we seem to, in this period of time right now, seem to have this epidemic of people who are, epidemics maybe not the right word, but it seems like that there are just a ton of people in very public settings that are walking away from the faith.
Well, that's a loaded question. I just and I'm speaking in broad generalizations.
Sure.
But I would say that one of the reasons why this has become more common is, well, let me back up. The first thing I want to say is this. And I say this in the book as well, there's nothing wrong or even unnatural when it comes to asking questions or struggling with your faith.
Right.
And, as an apologetics professor, one of the things I tell my students regularly is actually asking good questions of your faith is one of the best ways to strengthen your faith. If you never struggle through questions, if you never wrestle with God, then you're going to have a potentially a very fragile faith, a very atrophied faith, and actually that puts you even more at risk, because the first time life picks up a rock and throws this rock at your faith, it might shatter in a million pieces because you've never actually developed the resilience that you need by asking good questions and struggling with these. Okay. So one of the things I want to say right off is there's certainly nothing wrong with going through desert periods in your life of faith. There's nothing wrong with asking questions or struggling with doubts. And so one of the things I would want to say is, we need to give ourselves enough grace to ask those questions, and ask those questions in a way that I think a lot of people, Brian, that that deconstruct and end up leaving the faith, one of the reasons that they leave the faith is because they grew up in the type of religious atmosphere, the type of church background that actively discouraged questions, that actively discouraged the wrestling with faith. And so the minute that they started wrestling with faith, they took that as a sign that faith must not be real, that God must not be real. And John Marriott, who I reference a lot in the book, John Marriott wrote a book called The Anatomy of Deconversion. And one of the things that he discovered in his research is a large majority of the people that deconvert in their faith share the same background. They come from very fundamentalist, very rigid religious backgrounds that actively discouraged the asking of questions and the struggling with doubts. And so one of the things I really want to emphasize with my students and anybody that reads this book is there's nothing inherently wrong with asking questions or struggling with your faith.
Right. So it's almost like if you use the analogy of a weightlifter, it's almost like those muscles atrophy because you're not engaging that part of the intellectual part of your faith.
Well, yeah, and Alistair McGrath, he uses a different metaphor for it, which I really like. He calls doubts our faith antibodies. So,
So inoculation kind of thing. Yeah.
The person that always is sheltered from any sort of potential disease is also the person that's most susceptible to disease.
Right. Right.
Now, within limits, right? So if you expose yourself to too much disease, that's going to overwhelm your body and it's going to destroy your body. And the same is true, I think, with our lives of faith. Like, if we expose ourselves to nothing but toxicity, to nothing but doubts and struggles, whatever, like that can indeed overwhelm our faith. But if we are completely sheltered, if we run scared from any sort of questions or doubts or whatever, the result of that is we're going to be more susceptible and more at risk to doubts in our lives. But you asked another question, which I think is the really interesting question with a really long answer, perhaps. Why does deconstruction, what we call deconstruction, which that's a loaded term anyway.
Yeah. We've talked about this. I don't think it's a good term, but I mean, we don't get to choose.
Why is it so prevalent? I think again, I'm going to reference John Marriott again. So he was on our campus this spring talking to our students, and he made a really good observation. I wish I'd have known this observation before I wrote my book. But he made this observation. He said, the typical hero's journey is the hero sacrifices himself or herself for someone else or for the greater good, right? Like, that's the typical hero's journey. I'm going to sacrifice myself because sacrificing myself is a better thing so that other people can thrive, so that other people can survive, right?
Right.
The contemporary hero's journey, though, has turned that on its head. The contemporary hero's journey says, I'm going to sacrifice everything else, including the people closest to me, including the deepest held beliefs that I have. I'm going to sacrifice everything else for myself.
So I can be myself,
my most authentic self, right? So what we've done is we've made ourselves the center of all inquiry, the center of all curiosity, the center of all discovery. We've made ourselves the center. And what's happened in the process is what C.S. Lewis called putting God in the dock or putting God on trial.
Right.
So now when I ask questions about God, it's not in a curious way. It's in an accusatory sort of way. God is put on trial. And if God doesn't conform to my authentic understanding of myself, if God doesn't fit that, or if religion doesn't fit that, or if faith doesn't fit that, then I feel justified in leaving that behind. Because why? Because the most important thing, according to this new hero's journey, the most important thing is me being me, my most authentic self.
Right.
And the story of so many Christians that deconstruct, again, not all of them, I want to be fair, but the story of so many Christians that deconstruct is actually that anti-hero's journey, where I'm going to sacrifice my family, I'm going to sacrifice even my faith in God. I'm going to give all of that up in the attempt to try to discover my true and authentic self. And of course, that's a trap. Hebrews would say you're selling out your inheritance for a bowl of soup. But that's the decision that's being made by way too many people.
That's very interesting. I mean, just this week on my wife and I watched The Voice. That's kind of one of our things that we do together. And just this week, and of course, it's not the first time, but just this week there was a guy talking about, my upbringing, and when I came out of the closet, then my family rejected me, my church rejected me, and for a long time I rejected music. So this is it's fitting. I had never thought of it in exactly the way that John Marriott had put it, but that's fantastic. I mean, it's basically that's what he's doing. He was telling this kind of inverted hero story, and now he was glorifying this image that he was accepting. And
the outside world has no formative factor on you. Like it's there's nothing outside of you that can bring value to you. Only you can project value outwards.
That's right.
And so and I think that's when we've kind of talked about that. It's like some of these conversations sometimes that you get in these, trying to reason with someone on something like that. But if there's nothing outside of them that we can agree upon, it's only themselves being projected out, not anything real being projected back to them. It becomes very difficult conversations.
Well, and this is one of the key insights from the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is very countercultural in this regard, because I would say if there were a secret for Holy Grit in the book of Hebrews, the secret is take your focus off of yourself and fix your eyes on Jesus. The first 3 verses of the book give this epic picture of who Jesus is. He's the creator of the universe, the sustainer of everything. He's the exact representation of God. Like it's this grand picture of who Jesus is. And it's almost as if the author of Hebrews is telling us, if you want to have spiritual tenacity, the first thing that you have to do is you have to stop gazing at yourself in the mirror and reflecting on how hard you have it, and instead turn your focus to a magnificent Jesus who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, Hebrews 13, and who has saved you completely, Hebrews chapter 7. Like I think that's, if I were to summarize the secret of Holy Grit, it's just a diversion of attention back towards Jesus.
Right. And going along with that, I really liked what you had to say about that we are not our own. That it's that that's the other part of that. We belong to Him. This is what it means to be in faith. Is we placed ourselves in His. We're being supported by Him. We're placing ourselves in His life, essentially, as you quoted Paul there. So.
Yeah,
and I would appreciate that. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just to piggyback on that, Hebrews chapter 8 talks about how we're in a covenantal relationship with Jesus, or with God in Jesus. And, one of the things I play with my students, Brian, is, we talk about what does it mean to be in a relationship with God? Right. That's a nice little buzzword that we use. Like it's not a religion, it's a relationship, right? But Hebrews actually defines the parameters of what this relationship is. It's actually a deep, abiding covenantal relationship.
Yeah, and it's true. And I get what in that chapter you kind of talk about, well, we got to define this relationship. But the flip side of it, I was thinking as well, is the fall is a result of broken relationship, and that's that it manifests itself not only our brokenness with God, but also with one another and with creation itself, and within ourselves. We're broken ourselves. So we can't, for us to define our own being is going to be a marred image of what we were intended to be.
Brian, that would have been a better title for that chapter. I should have titled that chapter DTR. Define the relationship.
Define the relationship. That would be PTSD good for some people.
Or it's complicated, something like that.
It's not you, it's me. Something like that.
Or it's not me, it's you. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. No, what I was going to say is like the idea that atrophy, I'd gone through Hebrews with my small group. It's several months ago, but we spent some time on that opening of chapter 2 where it says like pay attention to your faith and don't drift away. And just that word drift away, like I'm not the Bible scholars you guys are. I use my Blue Letter Bible doing some of this stuff, but it had some like nautical ideas, like if this, you're being pushed by the current, you're being pushed away from this, and that it's so easy if we're not actively engaging in this, where you talked about doubt can have benefit. Well, if you have some doubt and you're wrestling with it, you're exercising those muscles. You're not letting the current just keep pushing you away. And that's such an important thing because if you're not exercising, you're getting weaker. You're letting the current just shove you further out to sea.
And we have an anchor stuff that you talked about as well there in I can't remember what chapter. You're the one who knows Hebrews better than I, much better than I. So
here's the number one question I got for Hebrews. Who wrote it? I mean, you've been teaching it for so long.
So some people run away from this question. I actually run towards this question. I have a pretty strong opinion on this. I think Apollos was the author of the book.
Really? Okay.
I think if you read the profile of Apollos in Acts 18, and lay that side by side with what we know from the book of Hebrews, he fits really well. Another thing that is an argument in his favor is the other book that Apollos is mentioned in the New Testament is 1 Corinthians. And so we know that Apollos was a very strong leader in the church in Corinth, so strong that he was being compared favorably to Paul. And some of the metaphors that are used in the 1 Corinthian letter show up in the book of Hebrews, like the milk metaphor that Paul uses, the race imagery in 1 Corinthians 9 shows up in Hebrews. So I think that Apollos likely had received and read the letter of 1 Corinthians and wrote the letter of Hebrews, probably sent it to Rome through Priscilla and Aquila, who were back in Rome after their brief exile. And this letter was written to those Jews who, like Priscilla and Aquila, were kicked out of Rome and then found their way back to Rome after that initial persecution. I think Apollos fits the profile. I think, to be honest, this is a little bit more controversial. I've become more persuaded in recent years that maybe Priscilla is not as crazy of an idea as I at once thought. I think there's some decent arguments that perhaps she might be the author. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that nobody thought of Priscilla as the author until literally the more modern times. But that's also true of Apollos. So.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that was a much more serious ansser than you ever thought you were going to get.
I was really just throwing it out there to be dumb.
I spent a whole week on authorship in my Hebrews class. I spent a whole week on it. I'm very interested in it.
That's cool. So. Well, it makes a difference. And the other question I was going to ask you is related to this. When we think about introductory issues, genre, it seems like Thomas Long's book a lot, and I don't know if you quote it more than any other, but it's quoted frequently. And he, and you even mentioned this in a footnote, or an endnote. I don't know what it'll be in the print edition. By the way, thank you very much. You shared a pre-publication copy so we could look at it. I appreciate that. But anyway, he uses the term preacher instead of writer, and he sees it kind of as a sermon, which I've seen before. There's, lacks some of the typical epistolary features up front and that kind of thing. What's your thought on genre?
Tom Long, I appreciate his commentary a lot. It's one of the, if not the most readable commentary that's out there on the book of Hebrews. It's really good. And Tom Long's own background is in preaching. He's a professor of preaching, and so he sees Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, as primarily a preacher. And so he's not the first one that had this idea, but basically the argument is that Hebrews is a written down sermon. With an ending, chapter 13, that looks more like a letter. So it's got an ending kind of tagged onto it. There's actually this verse towards the very end of the letter in Hebrews 13, where the author says, I thank you for bearing with this word of exhortation, for I've written you only a short letter. And so he uses the word for epistle in that verse. So he acknowledges that it is a letter.
Okay.
But that phrase, word of exhortation, that specific phrase in Greek is used in the book of Acts as a reference for a homily or for a sermon. Okay. So that's why a lot of scholars think of Hebrews as basically a sermon dressed up to look like a letter.
Okay. That's written down and sent. I mean, the whole point of a letter is it's communicating at a distance, somebody who can't communicate face to face.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And one thing to point out with this, your book is not a commentary on Hebrews. You know, we talked about like Tom's is the most readable commentary, but yours is not a commentary.
Yeah.
I'd say in the best. Yeah,
well, people have asked me what lane this book falls in, and it's not a commentary. It's also not a devotional book. It's kind of in between those two. The best way, and I hesitate to even use this comparison because I'm not anywhere close to being in the same league as this guy. But I kind of took my inspiration from Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson wrote a number of books on biblical books. So he wrote a book on Jonah called Under the Unpredictable Plan. Jeremiah. He wrote one on the Psalms called Along Obedience in the Same Direction. And and that's kind of the inspiration that I took for this book is I wanted it to be substantive, a little bit more substantive than what you find in a typical devotional. But I didn't want it to be bogged down in the exegesis and the Greek and the, what you would find more in a commentary. And so I don't know what you'd call it, a devotional commentary or whatever, but that's kind of the lane that I'm in.
In the best possible sense, and I want you to hear this as a compliment. I see it as it's the best possible example of kind of sermons, where you grapple with the text itself, and you draw meaning from the text, but then you make application to current situations, which I think, again, and I want you to hear it in the best possible sense. It has a sermonic nature to it, I think, in
that's I appreciate
in good sermons.
I don't take that. I don't take that as a criticism at all. I think that's exactly what I was trying to do with each chapter. Each chapter is connected to all the others, obviously, but each chapter also it has a distinct message on its own. Right. So yeah, I would say that's a good summary of my approach.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
So as off the topic of the book, as someone who has taught Hebrews for a lot of years, what have been what are the big insights that your students take away from are there any aha moments for them as you walk them through Hebrews or anything like that really seems to resonate with them as you work through it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the exercises that I do, if it's not on the first day of class, it's on the second day of class. But one of the exercises that I do with my students is I have them read through the book, all in one setting. Got that idea from Dr. Lowry years ago in seminary. So I have them read through the book all in one setting, and I have them make a couple different lists. I have them list some big ideas or big themes. I also have them list just some questions, some unresolved questions that come up as they read the book. And then we discuss that together. And what I encourage them to think through, Ryan, is what are the unique contributions of this book that would be missing if it weren't a part of the New Testament canon? So what are some of the unique things that we can get? And there's a handful of those things. Like one of the first things that comes to our attention is everything that Hebrews says about covenant. Covenant is a Bible word, right? It's a word used by Bible people, but it's also a rather rare word in the New Testament. There's not a ton of discussion in the New Testament about what exactly it means to be in covenant with God. That's really one of the unique contributions that Hebrews makes. The atonement theology of Hebrews 7 and Hebrews chapter 9. We get some of that atonement theology in Pauline letters, certainly, but Hebrews has a distinct way of linking together the Old Testament sacrificial system, especially the Day of Atonement, with what happened on the cross. And I've had a lot of students, Brian, that they'll read that section in Hebrews 7 through 10. They'll read that section, and all of for them, like, oh, so that's the reason why Jesus had to go to the cross. So that's the reason why a sacrifice had to be made. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we take for granted, but I think a lot of people in our churches, like, they know, yeah, Jesus died on the cross for my sins. But if you ask them why that had to happen, they struggle to formulate an answer. Why did the cross have to happen?
Right. And that's why I was saying sermons in the best possible sense, because, you know, if someone has grown up in the church and heard sermons and sermons and sermons and has never heard that depth, it's like, you know, that makes you wonder sometimes. But your insight about covenant, I'd never thought of before, but just roughly speaking, there's about the same number of times the covenant is mentioned inside of Hebrews than it is in the rest of the rest of the
times
New
that it's
Testament,
mentioned in the rest of the New Testament, it's
so
oftentimes
really
in association with the Last Supper or the Lord's Supper. But you don't get an in-depth description of what covenant means in that.
No.
You know,
right.
Other insights are
really
certainly
good.
Melchizedek always comes up. You know, students ask about that. And I love teaching Hebrews chapter 7 because it's so weird, you know, the reference to Melchizedek, but it's actually what he's doing in Hebrews chapter 7 is he's just exegeting Psalm 118. And if you're going to Psalm 110. Yeah. And if you're going to exegete Psalm 110, you're going to have to deal with Melchizedek. And so that's all he's doing there. And it's really interesting to track his approach to that particular psalm.
Yeah, people there's some really weird theories out there from that passage for sure. Yeah.
Because he has no beginning and no end.
Yeah.
Right. You know,
and
like,
even amongst the Jews,
from?
Melchizedek and the two figures that were these sort of mysterious superheroes to the Jews were Enoch and Melchizedek, because they're both shrouded in mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, the Enochic, you know, I was, you know, when you start reading some of that stuff, it's like, my goodness.
They're comic book heroes. Yeah.
He's everywhere.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, they were the Marvel in the Marvel universe of the first century Jewish people and before. So, Ryan, did you have something else you were going to bring up? Was there? I thought there was another part of the book.
You referenced. Okay, I'm going to say a social media platform.
Yeah.
That I saw you on Twitter. You know, I know that's kind of like your venting zone. That's what you said to us last time. It's kind of your venting zone. Yeah, but I think it kind of goes along with some of this. You read another book recently, Biblical Critical Theory. Yes. Uh-oh, he's going to show it to us.
There it is.
Yeah, so how do you see, how do you see this stretching our muscles? Like thinking about reading, like how do you see us stretching our muscles here? You know, this apathy, you're reading, you're in these books. Like if a common person in the pew, what does it look like for us? You know, is it reading books like that? Is it, what does it look like for us to actively engage ourselves in that? You know, I read the book, was it Love Your God with All Your Mind? Like, what does it look like for us to actively engage our mind? What would you say is you're actively engaging your mind to kind of develop this grit, this strength, this muscle to live in the context that we're in? Why is this so important for us to be having these conversations around some of these deconstruction
Colossians
ideas?
2:8 tells us to be careful not to be carried away by all sorts of hollow and deceptive philosophies, right? And I think what Paul says in Colossians 2 is just as, if not more, operative today, because it's so easy in our chronically distracted culture, where we're constantly being bombarded with images and videos and ideas, to the point of distraction. It's so easy for us to be carried away by hollow and deceptive philosophies. And Kevin Van Hooser, he says that the best immunization against being carried away by hollow and deceptive philosophies is the brain. Actually learning how to use our brain and learning how to actually think what, so not isolating ourselves from culture, but actually engaging our culture with our brains, with, a transformed mind, not conforming to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so, I think that Christians probably need to re-engage with the spiritual discipline of reading. And obviously reading scripture is a big part of that, but also just reading good, godly, encouraging books is a part of that too. Not everybody is going to read a 600-page book on cultural analysis like this, although it's a fantastic book. But I encourage all my friends and family to at least be in the discipline of exposing yourself to good content, good reading content, whatever your level might happen to be. Paul talks about how physical training has some value, but training in godliness has eternal value. And I think that one of the disciplines that we need to re-engage with is actually exposing ourselves to good, solid, biblical content that we're reading. That's easier said than done because we do not live, we're actually back in an oral culture. Sure. I think our culture has become an oral culture.
Or visual.
Which is sad.
The videos and that kind of thing.
But,
so I was thinking,
yeah,
you got an audio version, right?
Well, we can talk about it on a podcast. So, but when we had some of the issues over the past several years we've had, and we've seen the churches very poor response. And you quote some of this. You talk about 25% more or less of church members have not come back after the pandemic, and these kind of things. And I've said there's a generation that has been essentially discipled not by the church but by news channels. That's essentially been the discipleship. And now it just occurred to me as you're talking, we're having a generation now that is being discipled by TikTok, which is another kind of frightening idea. And so, taking the time, and it's hard for me. I mean, Ryan will tell you he's constantly on me about my failure to read, and it's it's not that I don't enjoy it, but there are so many other things that are going on. You have to actively, make it happen, and fit it in.
I'm
find
a broken record on this,
life.
but I just plead with my students, especially, like, I'm not asking you to delete your social media. I mean, I would be a hypocrite if I asked you to do that because I'm on social media myself. I'm not asking you to delete your social media. I'm not asking you to turn off YouTube or whatever. I'm just pleading with you. Can you engage your brain while you're taking all this stuff in? Actually think about it. Examine it. The metaphor I like to use is flipping over a river rock and looking on what's on the other side. Like, so don't just watch TikTok videos. Actually analyze, how is this discipling me? How is it shaping me? What's the message here that it wants me to adopt or to consume?
Right.
I just think Christians need to start maybe at that very base level. Like, let's actually start thinking our way through the culture rather than just mindlessly being discipled by it.
Right.
I was going to say, you talked about the importance of this. You talked about, like, you had your students go, what would 500 years ago, it'd have been impossible for you not to believe in God. And so Brian and I have read some of A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. We've gotten 3/4 of the way through it, but he talks about this exact issue, that it was,
that's a little jab at me, by the way.
It is a jab at him.
Hey, that's not
I'm the one who's
I'm waiting on him.
No, it's not. But it's been fantastic, and we use it. I mean, it's the kind of book that transforms the way you think. Like, immediately when you're talking about cultural headwinds and everything, we're thinking in terms of social imaginaries, and it transforms the way that you. It's that big of a book and that important of a book. But anyway,
but he talks about.
And you're the one who finally got us to read it, by the way. But anyway, go ahead.
But just that there's this. But you haven't read it, have you?
Yeah, he has. Yeah, he read it. Yeah, he read it.
But, he talks about this there's a constellation of beliefs out there now that, there's Christianity is just one piece of that. And we have to be able to see when someone else is talking to us, is this a constellation, one of the other stars in the galaxy that we could believe in, or is this true Christianity? And if we can't discern that, because again, 500 years ago, now it wasn't all good. They were being fed, theologically and so forth, but certainly was there was a smaller number maybe of things that were off the tracks, and so just kind of preparing our minds, exercising our minds to go, you're going to get bombarded with so much that is going to be totally off of the reservation as far as Orthodox Christian belief, and can we recognize it and not let I always talked about it's kind of like COVID. There's a virus. Can we not let a mind virus get in there? And it starts small, and then it spreads a little bit more, and then before you know, you're very sick, and you don't, you're on your deathbed. Theologically or spiritually.
It's interesting because I've been having versions of this conversation quite a bit with my 13-year-old daughter recently, and she's extremely compassionate. She is the best parts of my wife because my daughter leads with her heart, and so she's very loving, she's very compassionate, and so already at the age of 13, she's really struggling with the fact, like, she has friends who talk to her about, well, I heard Christians are hateful, or Christians just, they hate gay people, or all this other stuff. And she's really struggling with that. She's really struggling with her heart. Like, is that true? Like, are we hateful? Are we, and so one of the things that we just have talked about over and over again is kind of this idea, like, I don't want you to stop being compassionate. I don't want you to stop loving people, certainly. But I need you to understand, not everything that's said in this world or in this culture is true, and you need to stop making assumptions that you're the wrong one, as if you're always the one on defense. And I don't know if that's making sense or not, but I think a lot of Christians in this culture, a lot of Christians in this world, we've kind of come to see the message of culture as being the default position. Like it's just that's what's naturally true. And so for me as a Christian, I'm always on defensive. I'm always in this posture where I'm constantly defending what it is I believe. And what I want my daughter to understand is, no, you don't, like, the message that you're being given by the culture around you or by your friends at school or whatever, like, that's not necessarily true, and you don't have to act like it's true, but she's really struggling with that.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I get exactly what you're saying. I think you're right. And we see, I'm thinking about even peers that I had in college that now, in their social media are assuming the cultural narrative and basically criticizing Christianity while remaining Christians, criticizing Christianity and the church.
And I think that's what it looks like, cultural carried away by hollow and deceptive philosophy. I love studying philosophy. And I love studying philosophers that disagree with me on some of the fundamental points of what I believe. But to be carried away by those philosophies is to stop questioning them, to just accept them as givens or as truths. And that's what I worry about. Like, to circle back around to this deconstruction argument, I think that a lot of what gets called deconstructionism is just, frankly, Christians being carried away by some of the hollow philosophies of this world and accepting them as true.
Right. I do want to come back to one other thing, and this may be the last thing I have, and we'll see if there's anything else that we've forgotten to mention that you really wanted to get to, Chad. But you mentioned that there's only one stream that we talked about earlier of reasons that people deconstruct and deconstruct their faith. Again, I hate that term, but the I shouldn't say hate. Now I'm going to get criticized for saying hate, but you mentioned a couple of other things, and one of them is you talk about those who've been hurt by the church, for example, and again, I've seen the same thing you have, that sometimes they go from being some of the most dedicated and devoted Christians to becoming some of the biggest enemies of the church. Or I'm trying to think. I can't think of the word, but basically speaking against very strongly the church in the strongest possible terms. You mentioned that, and you mentioned bad behavior of Christians. Sometimes that there are examples of Christianity, and sometimes they're the ones that are most in popular culture. That you get. They make the news and this kind of thing, and the people then leave the faith saying kind of what your daughter's saying. Well, if that's what a Christian is, I'm not a hateful person. If Christians are this thing, then so I thought I'd come back around to that and see if you had anything you want to say.
So this is purely anecdotal, but every year in my apologetics class, I have students interview a non-believer and ask them, why are you a non-believer? The number one reason is because of suffering that exists in the world. That's the number one reason. But the number two reason that people give is because of experiences in the church, hateful Christians that they've met, hypocritical Christians that they've met. And of course, all of that needs to be unpacked. Like, what do you mean by hateful? Or what do you mean by hypocritical? The charge of hypocrisy is always kind of interesting to me, because when you charge a Christian with being a hypocrite, you're actually affirming Christian belief. Because otherwise the charge of hypocrisy literally makes no sense. So you're actually
That my rejoinder to that is always well, then you need to come to the church because there'd be one less hypocrite. And the interesting thing is invariably, and I've said that dozens of times, literally, invariably, what they will say. I mean, every single time they'll say, "Well, I'm not saying I wouldn't be a hypocrite."
I just what? I wish people would understand. Listen, meeting individuals that disappoint you, or individuals that don't live up to the gospel message, at least in your opinion or from your perspective, I'm not sure if that's a good justification for dismissing the gospel altogether. Matter of fact, if you understood the gospel in its entirety, you would realize that should send you closer to the gospel, because it makes you realize how much all of us need grace and forgiveness. And, but that invariably that excuse is used, and it breaks my heart, and it also frustrates me, because on the one hand, on the very human side of things, like, I get it, right? Like, you've had a really bad experience. You've had people in your life that have been mean or judgmental or hypocritical. So, like, on a human level, I get it. But it also just breaks my heart, because the bride of Christ should never be used as an excuse for not finding your way to Jesus. But that's what a lot of people do.
Right. Yeah. And as again, as you said in the book, it's our identity in Him is really what's at the heart of this whole thing. So. Yeah.
Wow.
Was there anything else, Chad, that you wanted to bring up?
This is actually, so you guys are getting the first public announcement of this. The release date has just been identified. The book will be released on June 6th.
Drum roll.
So on June 6th, we are officially launching the book. It'll be available on Amazon. It'll be available on Amazon several days before that. But we are officially launching it on June 6th.
June 6th.
So
and
the publisher is OCC
publisher?
Press. So this is a new initiative that Ozark is rolling out, and we hope to roll out. We've got a plan to roll out many more books in the years to come. But we've collaborated with a publisher in Nashville, Tennessee, who's working along with us to basically create our own publishing house. So, yep.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's an exciting thing too. So, well, June 6th then, look for it on Amazon and anywhere fine Christian books are sold. So, presumably.
Excellent.
What's the name of the bookstore that you're thinking about? Instead of the Berean bookstore, Ryan he's got an idea for Laodicean.
So you're neither hot or cold.
I just had a conversation about there seems to be. Okay, I'm going to share it anyway here in the. There's too much positive, like blessings and curses. We got to talk about the curses. We always talk about the blessings, but we never talk about the curses.
His idea is a line of things like you'd see in a Berean, but with these,
like the art boards, the paint boards, instead of like, for I know the plans I have for you, and it's but the negative one.
You'll be in exile for 70 years.
I just don't know how many housewives are going to buy that for the wall art of their house.
Yeah.
See, but it's not about the house. It's all about. It's ironic. It's fantastic. It's going to sell like hotcakes.
Irony.
Sorry, I didn't mean to pre.
Final note: I bought it. I got a T-shirt once that said, "God predestined me to have free will," and a guy at a Mexican restaurant, a waiter, comes up and he goes, "That's a logical fallacy. That's hilarious." And I'm like,
there you go.
There's got to be more shirts like this out in the world. Awesome.
Anyway.
Well, thanks so much, Chad.
Chad, it's been good to have you. You mentioned Twitter. What's your Twitter handle? Is that
the? Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to publish that one or not, since you said it's for ranting.
And then where else can people find you? Obviously on Ozark's website.
I do blog intermittently. I actually love to blog. I think blogging gets a bad rap. The reason that I blog is mostly for myself, just to kind of untangle my own thoughts. So if you want to see me actively untangling my own thoughts online, it's chadragsdale.com is my blog, chadragsdale.com.
And who wouldn't?
So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that, and actually I said to you there was one of your blog posts that I would like to have you come back sometime and we'll talk about maybe in more detail. Confronting my inner deist. I shared it with our listeners, and I think it's really it's good. It's a good good thing to think through.
I would encourage not that I'm any sort of expert in this area or whatever, but I would encourage anybody listening to this, if you're a person that is at all inclined to write, the best way to become a writer is just to write. And so that's one of the reasons I love blogging, is not necessarily because hundreds or thousands of people are going to read it, just because I like the opportunity just to kind of collect my thoughts and get them out there and get better at this task of writing. So that's the reason I do it.
Right. That's good. All right.
Very good.
Well, thanks for being on again, Chad. We appreciate it. It's been a good conversation. Hope you'll stay on again or come on again. So.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks so much. Brian, I'll see you. Chad, I'll see you some other time. But Brian, I'll see you next Tuesday.
Next week. We'll see you next Tuesday.
All right. See ya. Bye.
Bye.